Now, there have been many constitutions in Nigeria because the country has been overthrown so many times. But the most current system is a federal system created in 1999 that's basically modeled after the United States system. Nigeria has a presidential regime, but a strong presence from the military has led to the ousting of a few executives. We'll talk about these coups d'etats in a little while. They are a developing country as well, and they also slant toward socialism. We'll get into that as well coming up, but they are definitely our country that we would describe as developing, not a lot of industry, and so their economy tends to be non-advanced, and they're struggling to try to get their foothold in that. Furthermore, we would also consider Nigeria to be a rentier state because of their overwhelming reliance upon oil. Legitimacy and stability in Nigeria is a classic example of instability, and also that leads to a lack of legitimacy. Because of the constant threat of a military takeover, you just don't have very stable a country in that scenario. Voting indicates stability in a lot of regimes, and because voting is so controversial in Nigeria, there's always complaints that things are rigged or unfair, and part of it is based on an unreliable census. And so there is the perfect indicator that there is not stability because the elections never go well. Also, Nigeria is surrounded by nations from the French colonial tradition, whereas Nigeria itself is from the British colonial tension. And so there's always angst in that aspect as well. Nobody questions Nigeria's existence as a sovereign country, but the neighborhood is pretty rough, if that helps. Levels of government, we have a federal system in Nigeria. And like we saw with Mexico and also like we saw with Russia, a federal system in character, but in reality, much more of a unitary government with lots of authority at the top. Federal law forces all localities to operate the same way. So why bother even having a federal system if that's going to be the case? And you know, this is a rule of social science that if you don't let anybody make any decisions at the lower levels, then there's not really going to be any diversity or experimentation. You have a unitary system in effect. There are 700 local government administrations, 36 states, but they basically do what the federal government wants them to do. They have little decision-making power, and all they really do is be placed in charge of distributing the revenues that come in from oil. Nigeria started with the parliamentary system that was modeled on their colonizers, the British. Then they moved to a president with only ceremonial powers, and then we moved to a more full-on presidential regime like the United States has. The National Assembly is bicameral, and a speaker leads the House. The Senate is led by a Senate president. 36 states each have 3 senators. The House is based on population, all elected to 4-year terms. In presidential elections, a majority runoff is used. The winner must win at least 25% in 24 states. Like we saw in Mexico, we want diversity in the government in Nigeria. However, for them, it's more ethnic. They require that presidents get widespread support from amongst the different groups, who we'll talk about shortly. In the House, we have single-member district plurality, first past the post elections. In the Senate, each state is divided into 3 districts, all of which are first past the post. It doesn't really do you much good to try to figure out the parties in Nigeria because they're always changing, and that's because they're connected to ethnicity, and with each dominating religions, and because of the instability, things are constantly changing as people are adapting to the new normal that comes about. Elite recruitment is based on the military. As we'll see, the military is very important in Nigeria. If you want to rise to the top, be president someday, for example, you got to put your time in the military. Any discussion of Nigeria would be incomplete without talking about the military. You know, any place where you've had the military, launch coup d'etats 7 times in the last 50 years. This is a pretty important thing. So let me say we talked about this as an unfortunate trend of 50 years is a pretty long trend of authoritarianism via the military. And this is very common among post-colonial African nations. It's definitely not just Nigeria. And in some situations, maybe it was warranted when corruption or inabilities of elected officials was taking place, that the military stepped in. It's been both for legitimate reasons, seemingly, and for not so legitimate reasons. Some other elements about the military that needs to be mentioned is their location, which is it's predominantly centered in the north traditionally, and it's also dominated by the people who live there, which is the Muslims. And so the military is oftentimes in Nigeria synonymous with northern Muslims, and this is obviously to the angst of other peoples in the south and of Christian religion. So it's been another source of tension and cleavage in Nigeria. The judiciary in Nigeria is surprisingly solid because it is inspired by the Western judicial adversarial system. And so they were modeled based on the British, and so they have a 3-tier system, just like the United States has. And so, surprisingly, they adjudicate the law relatively fairly, especially compared to other African nations. One other thing, though, in the north, where you have Sharia law enforced in 10 of the states, you do have the judges adjudicating based on that law, which definitely causes a lot of tension throughout the country as they try to have some kind of similarity or commonality amongst the law in all the different states. On the other hand, there's a lot of corruption in Nigeria. And it's not the courts like we saw in Mexico that are corrupt. It is actually more likely to be the police or the military that's going to extort people. And of course their militancy has always made them hungry for power. Sometimes it was to stabilize a bad situation, but sometimes it was a power grab too. So all this kind of amounts to a very common problem, as we've seen, and that is of political corruption. Nigeria has a corporatist system that includes several preferred quangos, which you recall are quasi-non-governmental organizations. But there's very much a gray area here as to who they serve. They kind of serve the people, they kind of serve the government. But the most notable groups are those that are affiliated with oil and labor, the universities, and of course the military. Ethnic and religious associations are very common. For example, we have the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, MOSOP, which is going to fight for the oil rights against the Shell oil company that tries to come in and take the oil. Naturally, in a country that's half Christian, half Muslim, you're going to have groups affiliated with those faiths that are going to try to promote their interests. The Kaduna Mafia, for example, are northern leaders said to have much influence over the military and Nigerian politics. Many groups, instead of groups, many Nigerians articulate interests through patron-client networks. Prebendalism is the name for patron-client networks in Nigeria. So now we need to talk about the ethnic groups, and then we'll put this under the category of the cleavages that you have in Nigeria. A very divided country, largely based on ethnicity. And so the first group are the Hausa Fulani. This group lives mostly in the northern half of the country. They are rural, poor, and based on subsistence farming. They do have what they call stranger communities in the north, which are people of other groups that are kind of subservient to the Hausa Fulani. The Hausa Fulani are predominantly Muslim, and they're the ones who are in control of the military, which begs the question, if they have authority over the military who's taken over the country so many times, why do they continue to be rural and poor and subsistence farmers? Well, the answer is where the oil is, and that's in other parts of the country. The Igbo occupy the southeast and do commercial agriculture as opposed to subsistence farmers, small, poor farmers. They are known for their closeness to the west, and so you're going to see, to the western eye, the most affluent society in Nigeria. For example, more democratic, more education, more stability, a better legal system, rule of the law. Igbo officers led a military coup in 1966 that has led to the Civil War that ended in 1970. They are also predominantly Catholic, which is to say mostly Christian, as opposed to the north, which is predominantly Muslim. The Yoruba live in the southwestern part of Nigeria, and that includes the metropolitan city of Lagos. They are also traditionally subsistence farmers, and here's where you see a lot of the religious tension, 50-50 Christian and Muslim. So those groups would be the three predominant groups you see in Nigeria. There are many others, but they represent the ethnic cleavages that we see in the country. You could also phrase this as Muslim versus Christian versus tribal religions, all who are competing with each other. And then, of course, the Muslim North and the predominantly Christian South, which could also be articulated as the impoverished North and the more affluent South. So there's lots of different ways that people in Nigeria are divided. The political culture is relatively limited. When the people with guns are running around and really calling the shots, you can see how people wouldn't want to be too involved with politics. But people do engage in various forms of political participation, mainly the prebendalism for meeting their ends. But a lot of people get ticked off about the census, which is such a weird thing to be mad about. People know that representation and voting is all screwed up because they haven't renewed the census in decades, and so it's based on old material, and people kind of feel like the voting system is screwed up. But on the other hand, there is this spark of culture that came from independence, from Britain, and also the Civil War. So there is a degree of nationalism in so much as there's lots of ethnic divisions. But because of those ethnic divisions and your badge that you wear in Nigeria is very much the kind of people that you are ethnically, your family tends to be the main socializer of values. School to a secondary degree, mainly in the southern areas. But who you are and where you come from is the biggest political socializer in Nigeria by far. Speaking of the civil society, it's been a rough situation for a civil society to develop. And the obvious elements are the reason. There's lots of ethnic divisions. For a civil society to thrive, you have to have a lot of commonality with the people. And the source of so much trouble in Nigeria is the fact that people haven't always been able to get along. And so that hampers a strong civil society, and authoritarian elements too. Whenever you've got more worry about survival and about dealing with governments and government entities to try to make ends meet, you just don't have a lot of time to express yourself. And so we have a very weak civil society in Nigeria. However, we do have a very strong element of religious expression in Nigeria. Many Nigerians maintain their traditional religious roots. We have tribalism in addition to Christianity and Islam, and some have even blended those elements, what we call syncretism. And so, for example, you'll see Zionist Christianity in a lot of African nations where you'll see people talking about Jesus and doing some things that Westerners would recognize, but you also see tribal ritual and polygamy and things like that you might not see in a Western context. It doesn't make it less Christian, and it's just a different kind of Christian expression. And Catholicism and Igbo and a significant part of Yoruba are Muslim, and so you have this half and half element, which obviously is on the one hand religious diversity, and on the other hand it serves as a cleavage in society that spills over into politics and even into the military. Christian proselytizing, meaning witnessing the gospel for Christians, is banned by Muslims in the north who practice Sharia law, which makes it illegal. Terrorism, Islamo terrorism, is alive in Nigeria through this organization Boko Haram, which is a jihadist subsidiary of Al Qaeda, which does especially heinous things, kidnappings and raping of schoolgirls and blowing stuff up and burning stuff down. Have been a particularly ugly group in Nigeria. Westerners haven't paid too much attention to because they're not quite as wide in scope as ISIS or Al Qaeda, but definitely causing a lot of harm in the area. Between 1999 and 2003, 10,000 people were killed in religious conflicts in Nigeria. And this speaks to the 50-50 element of religion, Christianity, and Islam. And, another elements too, and the episode that kind of speaks to this the most is the 2002 Miss World pageant, where a journalist said, even Muhammad would think these contestants were beautiful, and 200 died in the ensuing riots. And so, religion is one of these things that modern society is shunning more and more for a lot of these reasons. But at the same time, you can't ignore religion and its deeply felt spiritualism for a lot of people, and the passion that they feel in expressing it. And so, like I said, it is an incredibly important element in Nigeria that makes things very complicated, and at the same time, it's one of these most foundational things that give people identity, and is just very much an issue in religion, or in countries all over the world, is religion, especially true in Nigeria. There are few newspapers in Nigeria, only about 30% read them. Most get their news from TV and radio, which is common these days. Until recently, these have been government controlled, but now satellite is adding more options. The BBC, for example, or even CNN, these have African divisions where you have reporters devoted to African news, and so people are getting a lot more of their news from those sources. And like we saw in China, a lot of journalists are frequently abused for questioning the government. But in more recent times, especially because of the Constitution, you see a lot of this reversed. Social movements, revolutions, and coups. So obviously the big one is independence from British rule in 1960. So the backstory of this, the British came because of the slave trade, and that obviously fed their empire for labor, which includes the North America and eventually the United States. The Berlin Conference in 1884 divided up Africa during the age of new imperialism, and the Europeans got together and carved up the map to suit their interests. And these are in the days after slavery, so now it's more about resources and markets. In Africa, people groups tend to correlate with the climate patterns, which moves from west to east. So you'll see changes in people as you go from west to east. However, in the post-colonial period, the colonial boundaries, which are drawn up by the Westerners in the aftermath of their empires, moved kind of from north to south. And so you get this cross-hatching of intersecting zones that grouped different kinds of people into one domain. So in other words, you have various people that were divided up into different countries instead of packed together into one country. And of course, the Westerners were oblivious to the subtleties of the ethnic differences amongst Africans. But that's why in Nigeria you have these various groups, which from the Western perspective, you can't really tell the difference too much, but for them there are striking differences, and they get packaged together in one country and tend to fight each other quite a bit. Now, as time has gone by, there has been some sense of nationalism for Nigeria. Independence created some of that. But that's kind of an explanation of post-colonialism throughout Africa that is still being played out today. We're trying to promote democracy in those areas and still kind of calculating the effects of colonialism on all these peoples. So more about the Civil War now, 1967 and 1970. This all began when the military ended the First Republic in a coup, which would happen 6 more times, of course. This coup was led by the people of Igbo, so don't make the mistake of assuming that it was Northern House of Fulani or Northern Muslims who launched it. It was actually Igbo officers who tried to break the region of Biafra into its own republic, basically. And the group was called Mossab. And part of this was ethnic, but if we're really being honest with ourselves, Biafra is where all the oil is. And so basically Igbo tried to strip themselves away from the rest of the country and take all the oil, and then everybody kind of colluded together to keep that from happening. And so the compromise was that both sides will agree to a Yoruban president, and he promised to return the country to civilian rule by 1979. So major episode in Nigeria. And the coming together afterwards, despite, I'm sure, sour grapes against the Igbo, kind of was something where everyone was divided, there was hostility, and they came together and solved the issue. And that was a second source of the beginnings of Nigerian nationalism, only for a time. I wouldn't say it's very strong today. But just think independence and civil war are the two times where they kind of were attempting to move toward a united people. Nigeria constantly changing politically due to ethnic, religious, and military tensions. Like I said, it doesn't even you shouldn't even bother trying to think about the political parties. Even the government structure could change as soon as we have another coup, if that happens. And at the same time, economic policy or challenges, it's slow to break from the resource curse. It's a curse. You're stuck with it. If you want to live and die by oil, instead of developing other parts of the economy, which they do have some things, but they have a huge reliance on oil, and we've learned quite a bit about how basically it is a ball and chain for all these countries that are rentier states. Socially, in Nigeria, citizens have frustration over a potentially wealthy country. I mean, a country with oil should be able to be, very affluent, especially with Nigeria because of their location, because of their Western connections, and because of the other resources that they have. But when you look at some of these statistics, 159 out of 177 on the HDI, 157 on per capita income. You just have a ton of poverty and a massive lack of development, which is why we call them a developing country. And perhaps the biggest challenge for Nigeria, as is the case with a lot of other African countries, is disease. There's just a lack of medical resources in the country. Part of this is economic. Part of this is educational. Part of it is actually cultural, too. You'll find in a lot of African countries that people don't, want to take something like AIDS. They don't want to do the safe and right thing because of some kind of, male, female social norms. But most of it is economic shortages and can't pay for the medications, the hospitals, the preventive treatment, and all that sort of thing. The other part of it is the climate. You live in a tropical climate, which nurtures malaria, infects virtually every resident. And you think about the implications here. It hurts the labor force, hurts education. When parents die, kids have to grow up very quickly, which means they don't have time for school. Relationships are damaged. I mean, it's just really striking. But particularly with AIDS, the most dreadful disease. Here in the West, we don't think about it quite as much as we used to, but in Africa, it is still a major, major issue. And in 2006, 4% of the population was infected. You got some of these countries, like Swaziland, for example, where half the population is infected with AIDS. 5 million of whom are between the ages of 15 and 49, that 4% of the population. 5 million people in Nigeria between the ages of 15 and 49 are HIV positive. Population growth is another economic challenge. They have a massive youth population, which makes sense when all the adults are dying of diseases. And just even if you do live it out, you have a pretty short life expectancy in developing countries. 45% are under the age of 15. Parents have many children due to the high risk of infant mortality. And that's another thing that people always ask about African nations, or any other developing country. Why do you have so many kids if you can't afford them? Well, because with these subsistence farmers, you have to have labor on the family farm. And so, if dad dies, then you got to have boys who are going to take over the work. If mom dies, you got to have daughters to care for the home and raise the other children. And so, these are the reasons why this happens. But so many of them die that you wind up with shortages, anyways. The urban population has grown to 44%. Leading to a drop in farming and food shortages. So, which is a problem for a country that has food shortages. More and more people are moving to the city to take factory jobs or oil industry jobs. And so that's adding to some of the problems that they have as well. In the north, census numbers are inflated to increase the revenue share. 1963 census, while clearly flawed, served as the official count for 20 years. And they redid it, but it's still unreliable. And then, of course, there's oil. Nigeria is growing more dependent on oil exports due to food shortages because there are fewer people are growing food. They can't put it in the market, and so they have to rely on the oil. After the Civil War, oil production boomed, and a wealth gap emerged, which is to be expected. And of course, at the same time as the other oil-producing countries were doing really well, like the Mexican miracle we talked about. Nigeria kind of had its glory days there, and then the same thing happened as happened in Mexico. They fell behind on their debt payments, and they really never have recovered. But it is the resource curse. 90% of their exports are oil, which is just not a very good portfolio to have. And so Nigeria, massive policy challenges, which are different than we saw with most of the other countries, which are more ideological, systematic. For them, their policy challenges are a little more life and death and survival. And it just tends to be a more dire situation. So they could very well have positive days ahead of them, but they're always kind of stuck in the middle. As being in Africa and being a developing country, you're kind of stuck with trying to have your own identity and get your ducks in a row. And at the same time, the affluent countries in the world, mainly in the West, are trying to aid you for probably their own benefit as well. But if you take aid from them, then you're dependent on them, and so there's this kind of a tug of war that goes on with that. So it will be very interesting to see where Nigeria goes in the future on either side of that equation. Lastly, foreign policy challenges. Nigeria was born at the height of the Cold War, which put them right in the middle of the tug of war between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is where we get the third world label. The United States is the first world. The Soviet Union, the communist bloc, is the second world. And so the third world were the pawns of valuable resources that could have been soaked up by either one side. So both were trying to aid countries like Nigeria because it would be good to have them on your side if things really went down in the Cold War. But when oil fell, the country was $73 billion in debt. The IMF and the World Bank were called in to do structural adjustments and reschedule debt payments. And so there's that dependency theory in action. Nigeria wants to prove that they can do things on their own, but then they take the aid, which makes them use the West as a crutch. Intellectual Nigerians often equate capitalism with colonialism, which is easy to understand. Especially when the West began prospecting for oil. Not only is there colonialism, but just the oil companies coming in, and eventually they seize their own oil, like most of the other oil producers have. So there's animosity with the West, and the thing they need to do is to open up the free market. But of course, there's all these kinds of people who will smear you with you're a colonialist if you're going to do that. And then, of course, we talked before about the proximity of Nigeria to the other French-influenced countries, and they've been working hard to try to band together with them, to try to generate more cooperation and economic development in the area. And so, in 1975, they spearheaded the Economic Community of West African States, which is ECOWAS, to unite the West African nations against French influence. France itself, that is, for them to seek better relations with Nigeria. And to a degree it was successful, but it just is an example of the African countries and collectively trying to advance into that industrial stage and doing all the things that they can possibly think of to facilitate that.